it's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome today the Norwegian Minister for Climate and Environment, Vidar Helgesen.
Thank you.
I'm German, for full disclosure. The German author Hans Magnus Enzensberger has described Norway as part museum and part laboratory for the future. Your country is Europe's biggest oil and gas exporter, but it also sources pretty much all its power from renewable sources. In fact, I think renewables are now, 70% of your total energy mix? Roughly, something like that?
Yeah, that's about it.
When did you get into renewables first as a country?
Well, hydropower has been with us for a good 100 years.
So you're only about 95 years ahead of the rest of the world. Right.
We've been lucky with nature, in a way.
True. In fact, to that point, and that may be part of the answer, how has that laboratory of the future managed to thrive alongside this thriving oil and gas industry?
Well, that's a very good question, a very complex question. I think we've been able to have a broad political consensus about how to shape our oil and gas policy, from the tax regimes to being open to international actors, to the revenue management, which is another important part of the relative success story. And we've been putting some of our resources to use for innovation, including policy innovations, such as in the electric vehicle policy. Obviously, being a resourceful country means you have space and scope and resources to try out new things.
Yeah, but there is, of course, always a temptation then, potentially, or incentive to or be complacent. And clearly, Norway hasn't been. In fact, electric vehicles, we've heard a lot about that today. But your government is actually considering to ban petrol fuel cars, not in this term, but looking ahead, I think there are scenarios that talk about 2025. Is this still something you're thinking about?
Well, we're not talking about banning, because that would probably be in contravention of European law. And we're, even if we're not a member of the European Union, we're part of the single market. But we have a political objective of no new fossil fuel cars sold by 2025.
Right.
And actually, our Environmental Protection Agency just came out with a report and a scenario, or 4 scenarios, 2 of which pointing to that target actually being quite realistic. Because as of now, this year, about almost 30% of cars sold in Norway this year are fully electric or hybrid. And the trajectory is very positive. So I think we'll be able to achieve that.
This report you mentioned came out last Friday, and it is broadly a look at how to make Norway, well, basically decarbonize the Norwegian economy, which is hard when you're talking about 15% of GDP, the oil and gas industry, 300,000 jobs, 20% of the government budget, 33% of the Norwegian export sector. So, this is a big deal. First of all, we'll come back to the political sort of implications, but first of all, what did this report concretely suggest, how to diversify and make other competitive sectors thrive?
Well, let me just give a little background on that particular report. We decided a couple of years back to establish an expert commission on what we have coined green competitiveness. It is, of course, facing the fact that oil and gas will no longer be the driver of our economy that it has been. We'll still have oil and gas around for a long time, but it will not be as important. So we need we need to build more legs to stand on. We need to build green competitiveness. This, we commissioned then 2 persons. One is the head of the financial services industry organization in Norway. The other one, Connie Hedegaard, the Danish former climate commissioner of the EU. They've been working on this report, which came out a week ago. And they pointed to the fact that probably because we have oil and gas is our by far most important source of income. We're now looking to, or many are asking, what will replace oil and gas? And there is no single answer to that. There is no business or industry ready to compensate for a declining oil and gas industry over the next decades. So we need not one major decision, but thousands of decisions that will determine whether we'll be successful. But they're also pointing to the need for tax frameworks to be in place to attract green investments. They're pointing to public procurement as a very important means of spurring innovation. And they're evidently pointing to certain sectors that, even if we're not inclined to pick winners, we'll know will be important for Norway going forward. The marine sector, seafood industry, marine resources not even yet discovered and put to use will be essential. The maritime sector and some of our key industries. But if we are to do that, we need, to be honest, there's been a sense, a complacency to some degree from the fact that we have oil and gas resources. Essentially, Norwegian politicians haven't had really to cut budgets for the last 30 years. It's been an upward story. If you tell that to European colleagues, they don't really believe it's possible. I think that will be changing. So we need a mental shift, and we need to realize that we need more rigor and discipline in education, research, innovation, and tax and regulatory regimes to enable new innovation and new industries.
You have been pretty disciplined, though, in terms of using the returns from the oil and gas industries and investing it into the future. To the extent that you also have got the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, are you using that money concretely for green investment purposes? I know some of it is probably invested in projects abroad, but in terms of the transition of your own economy, could that oil and gas fund, as it were, almost be used to make itself obsolete?
No, that fund, our sovereign wealth fund, is only investing abroad. What we're able to do is to spend or to inject a maximum of 4% of the annual revenues into our budget. We're currently at about 3%. But the fund itself is only investing abroad. Otherwise,
but that could be changed.
Well, it could potentially be changed, but I don't think that's a good idea. But we could make use of the revenues from the fund to inject into our budgets. Otherwise, it would be far too tempting for politicians to tap too much into the fund.
So you are pretty disciplined.
It's a matter of setting the right priorities going forward. But the fund has another dimension to it. Given that we're a small and open economy and we have a big wealth which is invested abroad, we're not only subject to the demand risk of the oil and gas industry, we're also subjected to the financial risks that Mark Carney has been mentioned several times today. Global financial markets and the financial risks global financial risks are of high importance to us, and climate change is a big issue in that regard too.
It's interesting you mentioned sort of trade-offs, I suppose, that you haven't had because you haven't had to worry so much about budgets, and certainly not budget deficits in the way that a lot of continental European countries have. You have a very generous welfare system. I think people are very attached to it politically in Norway. I've noticed that some of the measures that you use to incentivize green investment, for example, you do these feed-in tariffs now, modeled on the German ones, along with Sweden, and that's financed with a flat tax. And to the extent that there will be future trade-offs, it's that sort of thing where redistributive impacts of sort of transitioning your economy will begin to matter. Do you think that in the future Norwegians will have less of an appetite as a result, almost as if when they have to choose?
I think so. I think there will be more tough trade-offs to be made. Our demography is not as worrying as continental Europe, but it is still a challenge. And given that we'll not have the same level of oil and gas income going forward, we need to make tougher priorities. There is a strong appetite for state intervention, a strong appetite for more generous and better welfare systems, but it's going to be a tough reality, I think, starting in the course of the next decade, in changing the mentality of politics that you can always add some millions or billions to that and this and that budget. At some stage, we can't do that anymore.
moving outside of Norway for a moment, I mean, you deal as minister on a European level with other environment and climate change ministers, and I'm just wondering to what extent you have faith in an organization like the European Union to deliver the sort of regional policies that are necessary to promote the change we're aiming for mid-century. Do you think that on an international level, Europe will get there and maybe even become a leader again? It's slipped behind over the last decade.
I think Europe has to regenerate. We're not a member of the European Union, as I said, but we have decided that we'll go along with the EU in implementing the 2030 climate targets. And the Commission has given us very high targets, obviously, since we have a high GDP. So we have a belief that we should find European solutions, and we have a belief that Europe needs to strengthen ambitions. It's a bit of a paradox at times that we feel outside the EU that we have a stronger belief in European solutions than many that are on the inside. But I think we simply have no choice. And if you look at our electric vehicle policy, as an example, it's being looked upon by many European countries as quite attractive, but it's also now increasingly being looked on by European car industry as attractive. And the European car industry hasn't really been at the forefront of the climate change or climate policy agenda in Europe. That's changing. I mean, they've been holding the Commission back, in my view. It's changing, and it's changing because they're seeing competition from China, they're seeing competition from the US, and because the European market is more fragmented, they see a need for incentive mechanisms to be put in place. That's why I guess Volkswagen's management team came to Oslo this June to study our electric vehicle policy, and they asked if they could send European governments our way. We would welcome that because we think it is important to incentivize electrification of transport.
Absolutely. I will open this up now. We have 8 minutes left. Are there questions already? Otherwise, I can ask one more. Okay. There's one in the back there. Here we go.
So if we're talking about energy for tomorrow, there is a question which is key. It's the generation of tomorrow. So what do you think should be the role of education ministry? And could you maybe explain us how do you coordinate your policy with the policy of the Ministry of Education?
I think that's essential. I often say that when we look at Norway's future, both in terms of climate change and in terms of building green competitiveness, my colleague, the Minister of Education and Research, might be the most important climate change minister, because we need much more investment and more skills in engineering and science. We have beefed up research greatly in the last years. That will have to continue. We're actually both in terms of public spending and not least in terms of private sector spending on research, we're not at the forefront. In terms of innovation, we're not at the forefront in Europe. Our neighbors in Sweden, far higher than us. So we identify this as one of our definitely biggest challenges. And in that Green Competitiveness report that came out just a week ago, the Commission makes a very strong case for greening our research policies and our research portfolio. They're also suggesting a shift from what is currently a fairly strong petroleum research towards greener energy research. And they're pointing to the need for the education sector starting quite early to lead the way in building the transformational capacity of Norway. So it's a very important question, and it's a very important priority.
Before I hand over to this gentleman, just because I know you're a little bit of a gadget man, and I'm told that you check, you use the baby cam to sort of like watch your children and stuff like that. This is what I hear from your aides. But what is the most interesting, fascinating, innovative thing that you've seen in terms of technology that may not be out there yet, but what have you seen that you think that is a good technology of the future that we should be going for?
I don't think we're seeing, I don't use baby cams, by the way, but I am a
Ooh,
very fascinated by
I'm
technology.
told by a good source.
But I'm very much fascinated by the intersection of the developments in transportation and digitalization, and how this will transform mobility. Perhaps because we're seeing a need to we'll have to cut emissions drastically in our transportation sector, and there is so much promising happening. But obviously, the transportation sector is also incredibly important for reducing demand for and use of oil, and therefore, what can happen in terms of how we look at mobility in terms of low emission or zero emission driverless cars that can enable, and public transport that can enable a much bigger fluidity, better land use in terms of urban planning, etc., etc. I think we really see, we're just seeing the start of a huge potential there.
Okay, great. There were a couple of questions here. Yeah, the gentleman there and then the lady.
I've been studying energy for the past couple of years, and quite often you hear talk about a European supergrid that could be a possible solution for the future energy generation in Europe. And in these talks, quite often, Norway in particular is described as kind of the battery of Europe, which could be a solution for the storage problem that we have right now. What is your opinion on the feasibility of that option?
Well, we have very positive experiences with the interconnectedness of the Nordic region as one power market, and we want to see that expand. It is expanding towards the Baltics from Finland. We're currently constructing cables to Germany and the UK. That will be in place in a few years. I think that is absolutely essential to build more interconnectedness. And of course, we have significant hydro resources that can be of use for Europe's energy transformation. But we're actually also investing quite heavily in other renewable resources. We've just given the green light recently for the biggest onshore wind farm in Europe, in central Norway, and there are more opportunities ahead. So we see our energy policy very much in a European perspective.
There was a lady here. Then
as was mentioned earlier, 2/3 of carbon emissions come from the use of fossil fuel. We find across the world the environment ministers are very much supportive for action against climate change, not so much the energy ministers. Do we need to have a new movement where the environment and energy ministers of the different countries get together to sort this out?
Well, I should be careful here. It's up to the Prime Minister to determine and design the distributional portfolios, of course. Our energy minister is also a renewable energy minister. Yes, he's an oil and gas minister, but he's also the hydro minister and the solar. Even in Norway, we have solar. You wouldn't believe it.
like 3 months of the year.
And wind, of course, which I just mentioned. I think the important thing is to have whichever portfolios you have and however you distribute them, you need to have good interministerial process and good cabinet processes. And that's why I think we are able in Norway, even if we are dependent on oil and gas, also to have the most aggressive electric vehicle policy of any country. And it's probably the thing that is doing the most to undermine demand for oil long term. So we are able to do ambitious policies in different sectors and able to have very strict environmental regulations on the oil and gas industry.
When do you see the phase out actually happening? I mean, this is the plan now, getting out of oil and gas over time?
Well, you heard our Statoil CEO this morning. He came out at a different conference last week saying that demand will probably peak before 2030, and he's preparing the company for a future without oil and gas. Demand will determine how fast that trajectory will happen, but it has to be the horizon.
One final question. I did see some hands. What about this side of the room? No? Nobody? Okay. We'll have the gentleman over here. Final word.
I have a question on the industries in Norway. Norway is home to the largest mono production platform, mono for solar panels, the largest outside China. There is almost no support for mono production in Norway. Is there any reason why in Norway solar production as such of mono wafers is high, but public support is low? Or is it coincidence?
Well, we generally don't start our industrial policy by looking at where we can subsidize, where we need to look at where we can get revenue. And it's a very key premise of the Green Competitiveness Report, is that there are no shortage of solutions or people coming to us saying, we have this and this brilliant idea which will bring a lot of money, we just need your subsidies for a few years first. We're queuing up to say that also in the green shift. We need businesses to earn money. I think on solar, there's a lot of interesting things happening, but we are probably policy-wise lagging a bit because intuitively it's not where we've seen the great potential for Norway. But because of our minerals, for example, we do have a potential there that is quite interesting. But I would accept that in terms of policy frameworks, we're a bit immature there yet.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Minister. And I will, yes, applause, please. Handing over to my